Welcome, good afternoon, and welcome to an important, I'm Michael Ignatieff, Rector of CU. Most of you will know who I am, but those who are coming from the Budapest community, welcome. From the diplomatic community, from other universities in Budapest, we send you a very warm welcome. Glad to have you here. We are here to celebrate something pretty good. We have a book out. So this is a book launch. It's on sale upstairs. We got a great price. We want to move lots of units, as we say. And this book represents the collection of an extraordinary exercise in public education and institutional reflection that we conducted from January 2017, when we started, to June 2018. So it's nothing sort of miraculous that CU Press was able to bring this out as quickly as they did, because the last lecture was actually in June of this year. And so it brings to a conclusion an exercise that was both a university thinking about its own mission, we're committed to the values of open society, but also thinking about open society as a concept, and thinking about the political environment in which we have to work, and thinking about it critically and trying to imagine our place in the world, how the world has changed, from a variety of perspectives, some of them critical, some of them supportive of the idea of open society. And tonight we're going to have three incredibly distinguished intellectuals, public intellectuals, and distinguished academics give this book a hard time, and I hope I've given them strict instructions not to be polite and nice, and there are things that are missing in our examination of open society. I hope they will say so. I hope if they think there are things that we ought to have done that we didn't do, we ought to hear about that. And we'll hear from them in a minute, and the ground rules of it are very simple. They will have 15 minutes each, and I will be timing them tightly. And I will be timing them tightly because we're very anxious to have your questions, as we always do at these events. And so the event, which has started now, will end promptly at 7, and then we get to feed you, I think. We have a reception in Nador 13 next door, and we hope you will stay and have a discussion with us, and our distinguished panel will be there to talk to you a little bit. This project was important to the university and important to me because it began as an inquiry into our mission. And then, as you know, CU encountered what we jokingly call our little local difficulty. Our very right to continue and operate in Budapest was suddenly put into question. Our very place in this society, where we've been for 25 years, suddenly was put into question, and it remains in question as we speak. And so this is not just an interesting intellectual exercise. This ended up having a kind of existential consequence for us to think about our mission, to think about why it's under such ferocious attack, and how we, as thinking members of a university community, respond. Let me just say very few things about what we discovered about open society, and I summarize brutally. We did discover what open society is not. What it is not is a cosmopolitan, borderless, rootless, neoliberal market space for deterritorialized, super-educated elites. That's the cliche. Whatever else open society is, it ain't that. What is an open society? It's self-evidently a democratic political space, but it's one in which counter-majoritarian institutions exist to subject majority preferences of the people to the scrutiny of free institutions. And by free institutions, we mean the media. We mean the courts, and we mean universities. So it's a vision of democracy which is respectful of majority rule, respectful of the rights of the people, but insists that the rights of the people depend crucially on counter-majoritarian institutions that are free and can subject majority preference to the questioning that is essential to the maintenance of a free society. The other thing an open society emphatically is it's not a borderless space. An open society is a nation, a state that has borders, but not ones that bar entry on the basis of race, religion, or national origin, and which deny entry to those who are in fear of persecution or violent death. So the idea that open society is a borderless society is not true. But an open society is a society that answers the question of who gets in on the basis of some basic criteria of human rights, international law, and basic ideas of justice. Finally, an open society is a place full of patriots. It's not a denationalized space at all. It's a place full of patriots, civic patriots, united by values, by respect for national traditions, but who debate and discuss and elaborate those traditions in open debate. And nobody possesses the identity of a nation in an open society. In an open society, who we are is the subject of the national conversation, and the national conversation can only be vigorous if it's free. And finally, an open society is a place that believes, and this is central to our mission, it's a place that believes that there is such a thing as knowledge. The knowledge is very hard to find. You need discipline to find it, and you need to respect the disciplines that cherish and protect knowledge. And that knowledge is found in dialogue and debate and discussion among free people. And that when that knowledge is found, it's the only basis upon which democratic choice can be made. That's what I think I learned from our discussion over a long time about an open society. And now we're going to learn what other people learned when they read our work. David Runciman, professor of politics at Cambridge, on my far left, will start. And then we have Ruth Wodak, professor emerita from Lancaster and from the IWM in Vienna, and John Tasioulas from University College London and the School of Law. I'm incredibly grateful to these busy people for coming, and we await your discussions and criticism and comments, and you have 15 minutes. So there we go, off we go.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a really interesting and deeply thought-provoking book, and I say that as someone who hasn't just read it, but who has just reviewed it. In the Times Literary Supplement, and I'm going to tell you some of the thoughts it provoked in me, including some of the things that I felt was missing. So one thing I was struck by in this book is, inevitably, there is a focus in thinking about the contemporary enemies of the open society on populism. A number of contributors use that language. And a few of them identify as one of the modes of populist politics the use of conspiracy theories. And I think we all recognize this, that there is a set of politicians around the world, some very prominent ones, a set of movements that operate by believing that any opposition they face is the result of some plot, some group, some secret set of individuals, or some generic set of individuals who have conspired against them. Donald Trump is the conspiracy theorist in chief, and that's not just a term of mockery, that is true. It's how he operates. It is his mode of politics. And yet I was struck by the fact that none of the contributors, unless I missed it, pointed out that the person who coined the phrase conspiracy theory, and I have a colleague in Cambridge who studied this and has made a pretty convincing case that this is where it enters the English language in its something close to its contemporary usage, is Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies. Not in the first edition of 1945, but the second edition, I think it's 1952, where Popper introduces a new section in which he describes what he calls the conspiracy theory of society, which is absolute anathema to him. And it is the view that deep structural social forces that seem persistent and intractable can only be explained by positing some group of individuals, often a secret group of individuals, who have deliberately set it up that way. The plotters, the conspirers, who made it so that the poor are always poor, or made it so that the society is so unequal. And it's anathema for Popper, above all, because it is non-falsifiable social science. The point about conspiracy theorists is they are never wrong. And there is no evidence you can present to a conspiracy theorist that will persuade a conspiracy theorist that the truth might be other, because the evidence is part of the conspiracy. So inevitably, if you're Karl Popper, this is the worst form of epistemology that there is. So this isn't discussed in this book, which it's not the phrase that Popper's best known for, though it's now the phrase that he coined that is most ubiquitous. But I think it's also true that what Popper meant by the conspiracy theory of society is actually slightly different from contemporary populist conspiracy theories. I'm going to take Trump as the exemplar of this. So for Popper, it's the conspiracy theory of society. So it's a social theory. It's to explain social phenomena, deep social phenomena, structural phenomena. The conspiracy theorist tries to explain the entire setup of a society. I don't think Donald Trump has any interest in the entire setup of a society. I don't think he's interested in why the poor are poor or why inequality is widening. Trump, like I think almost all the populists in this model, are conspiracy theorists of politics. So the conspiracy theories are not about social phenomena, they're about political phenomena. So Trump entered politics as a birther, that entered presidential politics, someone who claimed that Barack Obama was not qualified to be president because he'd forged his birth certificate. Trump claimed that the reason that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote was because there were dead people on the electoral register. Trump claims that the investigation into him and his Russian links is fake news and is the product of the deep state, not deep society. This is a conspiracy theory of politics. And also, Popper took seriously that these were theories. So like that's not just some accidental phrase for him. This is a pseudo version of social science. These are theories. I don't think Donald Trump is a pseudo social scientist. I don't think he has a theory of anything. He is opportunistic, he is adaptable, he is flexible. So Donald Trump does not have what Popper feared, which is the conspiracy theory of everything. What Donald Trump is a conspiracy theorist about anything. He will give you a conspiracy theory about anything, especially if it's politics. But it doesn't have to hang together. In fact, it doesn't hang together. His conspiracy theories are pretty inconsistent. And this whole mode of politics is not the conspiracy theory of society. It's the opportunistic use of conspiracy theory in politics. And that's a long way of saying what I took to be one of the themes of this book was that the lines between the open society and its enemies are actually getting blurred, because the enemies are much more opportunistic, much more experimental, and in some ways much more open than they used to be. And Michael says this in his introduction, that it is striking that Chinese and Russian forms of illiberal politics have lots of aspects of openness in them that Popper would have been surprised by. Open borders, open trade, actually quite a lot of free expression, because the desire of the Chinese state is not to stop people expressing themselves, it's to monitor and surveil what they say, which is different. So that line is potentially at least becoming a little more blurred, though there is clearly an absolute difference between the open society and its enemies. But the open-closed, if the enemies are, among other things, more experimental than they used to be, so Roger Scruton makes the point, I think, in his essay that some of the epistemological benefits of the open society are entirely, in Scruton's terms, the economic benefits consistent with the illiberal Chinese model. That is, trying to find the price of something in a market and so on. So that was one thought. The inverse of that thought that came out of reading these essays is that the other thing that's possibly becoming, if not more blurred, at least harder to draw the line, is that for the critics of the open society within Western democracies, the criticism is often not, we don't like the open society because we believe in the closed society. The criticism is, the open society is closed to us. That is, the open society is hypocritical. It professes openness, and what it actually is closed to, quote unquote, ordinary people, common sense opinions. I mean, that range of, that other register of populist thought. And so the argument is not the advocates of the closed against the advocates of the open, but the people who say that the open is closed to them. And I would say that the institution that is in the firing line of that form of discourse is the university, including, of course, this university, which is emblematic of it in many ways. That idea that, as it were, the Open Society has pulled up the drawbridge, which it's a very powerful argument. It resonates in lots of ways. I mean, it's clearly become very politically powerful. This is true across Western democracies. It's true in the United States. It's true in Britain. And part of the irony of this, of course, is that the university, as many of the contributors in the book say, is the Popperian model of the Open Society. I mean, it's partly what the ideal is. It is, at least the ideal version of the university, a place where knowledge is pursued, but it's always contingent, it's never fixed. No one ever says, now we found it and we're going to stop. You keep going, you question it, you challenge each other. You challenge each other not on the basis of who you are, but on the basis of what the evidence says. Ideas like peer review, these are the ideals of the Open Society. And they are under attack. And they are under attack because the belief is that they are a protection racket. I mean, that's how it comes out, that actually in universities what people aren't doing is challenging each other's ideas, but reinforcing each other's ideas because it's closed off to a whole set of ideas. And that whole rhetoric that we hear, it's there in the United States. It's so raw in the United States now. I was reading an article this morning, didn't read the article, but the headline was, "Campus Politics Comes to Congress," a pro-Kavanaugh account of what happened last week. Mm-hmm. Attitudes to the liberal, as it's perceived, the liberal elitism of American universities was a really important factor in the election of Donald Trump. In the Brexit vote, whether someone did or didn't go to university was a better indicator of how they voted than gender, age, or class. So this is written right across our politics, this fundamental tension. And yet again, I think there's a big difference between how we might see this and how Popper would have seen it. And to do it very briefly, I think the difference is that when Popper wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, even by the time of the second edition, even by the time of the third edition, in a society like Britain, almost no one went to university. Between 1% and 2% of British people went to university after the Second World War. Even in 1964, 2% of Britons went to university. And now among the under 40s, it's close to 50%. So at the time Popper wrote this, the university was not part of society. It was in some sense apart from society, and then it could be a model for a kind of society. Now, as it were, the university view of the world is somewhere right down the middle. It splits societies down the middle. The gulf used to be between the electorate, who only a tiny number of whom went to university, and their representatives, many of whom went to university. Now all their representatives go to university, and half of them have gone to university, which leaves the other half feeling that there is some kind of, for want of a better word, conspiracy going on here. And so this is a phenomenon of the last 20, 30 years, just that demographic shift. There have never been societies in human history where there are age groups where half of people went to university and half of people didn't. And so this has now become a social division. It might once have been a political division, but it is now a social division. And that is something new. I don't know, we can discuss it. It could go in a lot of different directions, but part of what this book makes one think about is the ways in which these tensions are being framed in really new ways now, depending on where you draw the lines socially and politically. 2 more minutes? One last thing. So there's another iteration of that phrase that Popper coined, the conspiracy theory of society. He gave it another twist. And in a later version of the book, he called it the conspiracy theory of ignorance, which is the view that when people en masse seem to be stupid or ignorant, it's not because knowledge is hard, it's because someone has conspired to conceal the truth from them. The conspiracy theory of ignorance says if people can't see what's true, it's because a secret group has hidden the truth. And that is the conspiracy theory that liberals believe in. So the other way this line has got blurred is we shouldn't think the populists are the conspiracy theorists and the liberals aren't. So I just say this as someone who lives in Cambridge, England, the most pro-Remain town bar couple in the country. And after the Brexit vote, you heard people, really intelligent people all the time saying, the only way that could have happened, the only way 52% of people could have done this is that they were tricked. Yeah. And then who tricked them? Cambridge Analytica, Putin, the Mercers, Rupert Murdoch. Now, don't tell me that liberals aren't prone to this vice too. And so we should remember that these lines, they get blurred in lots of different ways. In this very, very fraught political age, we have to be careful of assuming that we know which side we're on, even when we think about, to me, the most resonant Popperian phrase of all, the conspiracy theory of society.
Thank you. Boy, that was great. There's lots to talk about. Let's go right to Ruth Wodak for an additional comment.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here and to discuss this very interesting book. I actually would love to start discussing with you. I just have to say one thing. I think that the conspiracy trope is much older, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I should say, I'm just talking about the phrase conspiracy theory, not the idea. It goes way back.
Because it's one of the oldest anti-Semitic tropes we know, and the Elders of Zion is protocols, is document.
I should have been clear. It's Popper who put the word theory next to it. It was known by lots of different names. He's the person who gave it. Because that's one of the oddities that we call it a theory.
Well, and
I'm not going to say anything else.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that, and I think it makes a lot of sense, especially in the CEU and where we are right now, because the conspiracy theories about Soros, and here it comes back, both the Open Society and the conspiracy which you mentioned, and the alleged sort of accusations and so forth, and fantasies, as well as the anti-Semitic fantasies of the world conspiracy and so forth. So I think it's important, and I guess that Popper, being impressed by National Socialism and having had to flee and being in exile, was also very struck by the anti-Semitic ideologies in Nazism. So I think it comes together, and I'm not knowledgeable enough now to trace it in Popper exactly, but I would assume that there is something to that, and it would make sense to do a historical semantic analysis. Anyway, that was just a quick response. For me, this book was really interesting, and I'll say why in a couple of seconds. Not only because it was written here now at this specific time and addresses sort of problems in the EU and beyond right now, the huge tensions between the closing of societies and trying to remain open in some ways. I mean, in the EU especially, on the one hand, we have the Human Rights Charter as part of the European Treaty. And so all EU states have signed into that. It's the Section 2 or Article 2 of the treaty. And human rights is obviously one constitutive part of the open society. And on the other hand, we have countries which are changing very quickly into what is called by Orban illiberal democracies, which is called by Ivan Krastev managed democracies, whatever. You can neo-authoritarian states. There is a whole lot of jargon floating around, and I want to say something about that as well. But it is right now, it's what Chantal Mouffe calls the populist moment, which this book is being launched, and I think it really contributes a lot to this discussion. And in that way, I was absolutely fascinated in reading a lot of the articles. Now, I'm not a historian, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a discourse analyst and a social scientist, and in that way, I have a different approach to it. And one of the things which I would have liked to have elaborated more is the specificities of this illiberal democracy, or of the trajectory to illiberalism or managed democracies, or however you want to call it. Because I think we need to be very cautious to map out what is happening in the diverse societies, and very different things are happening in different places, so it's very context dependent. So Italy is, and Lega and the Five-Star Movement are very different from Fidesz, are very different from the Austrian Freedom Party, and their impact and power and influence is also very different. And the sort of the European stage reacts very differently to all these parties and to their discourses. And of course, we cannot see it without the global frame, which you talked about, namely the US, Russia, China, and all of that. So I would have liked to see more specific analysis, which would allow us to confront, or criteria, when is a society still an open society? Are there criteria not to measure? I'm not somebody who likes to measure, but somebody who likes to at least illustrate, yeah, and see, map those trajectories. Now, I was specifically interested in several chapters in this book, specifically by Timothy Garton Ash, who talks about the freedom of opinion and press freedom, and Jan Werner Müller, who I know well and who does research on populism, and then the chapters on democracy and communication, because to those I can relate best. And I think that we have to come to grips right now with the situation where the post-war consensus in the EU and in Europe is being turned over, yeah? Or many countries, many governments are trying to dismantle this post-war consensus. And that post-war consensus had a lot of aspects and dimensions, one of which is the human rights, peace, and sort of dialogue in many sort of public spheres. So thinking of Habermas and the entire discussion about the public sphere and which public spheres and how can we participate, is there enough legitimation of, and obviously there is not enough legitimation of the European Union. There is a big problem of representation and legitimation with the EU, which leads to what is always called the democratic deficit, but actually means that all of us cannot really participate enough in decision-making. And I think this is an issue which we have to confront, and that's right. It's just the case. Democracy should not just be, or we shouldn't define democracy only via election, which is what illiberal democracies do, and you then have, well, we're all elected in democratic ways. But that's not enough. We have to have the checks and balances and the institutions, which are right now challenged in Hungary, in the Visegrad states, but also in Austria. If you read the newspapers, and I'm sure you have possibly seen television about the recent Austrian developments, and actually an attack on critical media, an explicit attack by the Ministry of Interior Affairs. So we have these small steps, yeah, it's not. And in Italy, obviously, we have other attacks on. So I think we need to define the terms very clearly and the concepts. And we need to think about what does participation and dialogue mean in these changed situations. And that is something where Rose Sabalon does talk about it, and I think he has a very interesting approach and is a very interesting way of framing participation, namely that citizens should be able to participate locally much more than, is usually possible with regional, local elections and so forth. But basically, that's what we do. We vote, and then there's nothing, and in 5 years, we vote again. Yeah, and that's basically participation. So what Runciman says, we have to have participatory democracies. And I think I would have loved to see a chapter on Ireland. Yeah? Because for me, Ireland is really an interesting example. And I'm only watching it from far. I've no inside information more than what you can read, but the way dialogue and a different kind of dialogue is enabled by having people selected by Lotto, yeah, and then sitting together for an entire year, every weekend or one weekend a month, deliberating in the true sense of deliberation on a very sensitive topic, coming up, being able to invite experts, and then coming up with a paper about a very sensitive topic like abortion or gay marriage. Mm-hmm. And that paper is then taken seriously by Parliament. Mm-hmm. It's an extraordinary achievement and is so much better than referenda or all these other ways of direct democracy. So I think that the Irish example is a very good operationalization of what Runciman is actually proposing and would make it possible to look at these forms of communication. Now, what I'm worried about, and there I would like to challenge Müller a bit in his what is populism approach. First of all, there are very different populisms. So we have left wing, we have right wing, they're very different. There's inclusive nationalism, exclusive nativist nationalism. So there are different ideologies. And framing it just by populism, I don't think that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's too general. Now, when we look at what Jan says here, he says, well, we have to talk to the people. We have to listen to the people, yeah, those who are intuitive and have all this common sense. And we have to talk to them, take them seriously. But then there's a red line. Yeah? Certain things we do not allow, and we draw this red line. But what happens if those people don't want to talk to us? And this is the phenomenon which I have come across in my analysis now frequently in German and Austrian television debates, which I analyze and as sort of my profession, and where you have people saying, well, that's all very interesting, and I think you're right, but I don't care. And then you kind of sit there and think, okay, they think we have something to say, the argument makes sense, but actually they reject dialogue. And it's very difficult to then enable dialogue because, and you're not their therapist. I mean, you can't ask them, why don't you want to talk to me? Or is this topic too sensitive? Or, that's not what we do. So in my experience, and I have experienced such conversations and interactions myself, but I've seen many of them in the recent Austrian elections, and I've seen them in Germany with the AfD. And there are concepts of dialogue, of deliberation, of Habermasian argumentation, rational reasoning, all go down the drain because they don't work. And that is really a challenge. So what do we do if people don't care? Yeah, when we talked about that before we came here, the shamelessness, it just doesn't matter. Or anything goes. We could label it with Feierabend. Anything goes. You don't apologize, you're rude, you're offensive, you don't talk, you don't answer, you interrupt, you abuse. you're sexist, you're, racist, anything, it just doesn't matter. And you don't care. And for me, this is the big challenge right now, which we're experiencing. And just to, if I have one more minute.
One more minute.
Yeah, just to finish it. There are, of course, formal attempts, and as I analyze this discourse, you can always see formal apologies. You can see what we called the Haider form of apology, about after Jörg Haider's name, basically somebody who really created that form of discourse, populist, right-wing discourse. And that was Haider's apology. What Haider did, and I think many of those leaders are now doing that, is he said, actually, I have to apologize. After he said something terrible, revisionist, racist, anti-Semitic, something. And with this speech act, he addressed two audiences. On the one hand, he addressed the audience, his core voters, and said, well, they are forcing me to apologize. I still stick to my opinion. But on the other hand, he formally apologized. So he did what was expected. And that's what I think is happening now. So you have formal consents and compliance, even that not always, but content-wise, non-compliance. And this is, again, very difficult to cut through and to engage with the content and not on the formal level. And there is some very good analysis actually about Orban and Kaczynski doing that on a regular basis. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. The timekeeping's been pretty impressive, wouldn't you agree? And they're all doing it for you so that you can store up fantastic questions. So soon you will be, got to get ready, get a question ready. I drive everybody crazy in this room by reminding you that a question is a short interrogative statement followed by a question mark. That's what we're looking for. Up here we make statements, down there you ask questions, and that's how it gets good. So get them ready. John Tasioulas.
Thanks so much, Michael. I've got to begin by correcting something you said. I'm at King's College London, not University College London.
Oh my God, did I say that?
That's a narcissism of minor difference, but it's important to us in London.
Please forgive me.
That's the only criticism I'm going to make in the rest of my talk. So the volume we're discussing today is a very important series of meditations on the crisis affecting liberal democracy. And by liberal democracy, I'm going to understand that in terms of a form of society committed to what I'm going to call the Trinity, the Holy Trinity of liberal values: democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And these are a holy trinity because they're not only seen as values that determine whether a government is a good government, but whether it is a legitimate government, i.e. whether its laws and directives are genuinely morally binding on its citizens. There are many, many themes in this book concerned with challenges and opportunities confronting liberal democracies. And what I'm going to do is talk about three themes that struck me in particular. One is the theme of how we understand these individual elements of the Holy Trinity and their relations, so a kind of conceptual normative question. The second question is, what are the social and psychological preconditions for realizing these values? And the third theme is, what is the role of international organizations in enabling us to realize liberal democracy? So let's take the first question. The first question is this conceptual normative question. How do we understand the three elements of the Holy Trinity and the relations amongst them? Can a state comply with the rule of law even if it's non-democratic? Can a state that is democratic be democratic if it's not fully complying with human rights? Now, in the stylized way of philosophers, I'm going to distinguish between two broad sorts of answers to this sort of question. The first kind of answer is what you might call a Platonic answer. And the Platonic answer sees these liberal virtues as highly unified. Plato's portrait of the virtuous man was that the virtues come as a package deal. To have one virtue, courage, you have to have the other virtues. justice, wisdom, and so forth. The Platonic answer says the liberal virtues come as a package deal. As Michael puts it in this volume, for example, an illiberal democracy is a contradiction in terms. On the other hand, there's what might be called the Berlinian view, after Isaiah Berlin, according to which the three values captured relatively autonomous concerns that, far from forming a harmonious, integrated whole, sometimes can generate even tragic conflicts. Now, it seems to me that we delude ourselves if we think it's self-evident and uncontroversial which of these approaches is the correct approach. And there's no better illustration, I think, of this than a dispute that broke out 8 years ago in Britain between our leading judge at that time, Lord Bingham, and our leading legal philosopher, Joseph Raz, over the question, what is the rule of law? You might think the most straightforward of the Holy Trinity. So what is the rule of law? Raz says the rule of law is a set of requirements on law, that law should be clear, publicly accessible, that it should be able to be complied with, and that it's applied according to its meaning by officials. In addition, the rule of law requires an independent judiciary. It requires an accessible legal profession. These are basically formal and procedural requirements. And then Raz twisted the knife. He said, and by the way, a society that was racist, that persecutes people on the basis of religion, that has no regard for issues around poverty, could better comply with the rule of law than an enlightened contemporary democracy. Okay? That's his understanding. It's an understanding that goes back to Hayek. It goes back many centuries. Bingham, of course, was scandalized by this understanding of the rule of law. He said, what's the point of having a rule of law if it can be complied with by a state that, for example, sends some of its citizens on account of their race to the gas chambers? What does it matter if it's doing so in accordance with clearly publicized laws that the officials are applying according to their terms? That is not any conception of a value that I'm going to take seriously. Bingham drew the conclusion the rule of law must include compliance with human rights. Otherwise, it's not a value. Tending towards the Platonic view. In a subsequent interview, Bingham said, the rule of law is the closest thing we have to a secular religion. So you can get rid of the church, but you don't necessarily get rid of priestly impulses. For him, the rule of law was taking the place of religion. Now, it seems to me there's a problem here. The problem is that Bingham seems to be in the position of someone saying, what's the point of being healthy if I don't have any friends and I haven't accomplished something with my life? Does it follow from that that health is not a value, that it's not a distinct ingredient of a good life? It would seem not, right? So the Berlinian response would be to say, the rule of law is one value amongst others, just as health is one value amongst others. The fact that you're healthy doesn't guarantee you have the other values equally. The fact that the rule of law is being complied with doesn't imply that the other values are being fulfilled. A similar issue arises with respect to democracy, rule of the people. Can a democracy be authoritarian, or must it guarantee an extensive schedule of liberal rights? Now, there's a very compelling essay in this collection by Professor János Kiss defending the Platonic answer to this question. According to him, violations of rights is not just a bad thing, something we can agree on, it is specifically a democratic deficit. You are not being truly a democracy if you're violating rights. Now, that is the Platonic view that I'm suggesting conceives of these values as deeply mutually implicated. But it's far from uncontroversial. An important recent book by the American classicist and political theorist Josiah Ober reminds us that just as there was liberty before liberalism, there was democracy before liberal democracy. And drawing on historical origins of democracy in ancient Greece, he goes on to elucidate an understanding of the democratic norm, not as a majoritarian tyranny, but as a limited form of collective self-government by citizens, one that does neither inherently opposes nor incorporates those liberal rights or human rights. There's another dimension to this. I focused on kind of high-minded philosophical point, but there's also a pragmatic dimension. If you want to sell the rule of law to the Chinese, do you also say to them, oh, and by the way, it includes all these human rights? What's the best way to propagate these values? As a straitjacket? A package deal that has to be accepted as a whole or not? Or are they importantly distinct elements? So there isn't just a matter of conceptual tidiness, it's a matter of how the rhetoric is going to work. Second question that I said I would discuss, and Michael, you've got to tell me when I go over time.
You're doing all fine. You got a little time. Keep going.
Good. The second theme is, what are the underlying psychological and social conditions that enable the holy trinity of liberal values to be realized and reproduced across time? And that's a question, that's an issue that resonates with the question addressed especially by Mark Liller and Roger Scruton in this volume, about whether the open society must in some respects also be a closed society, i.e. whether freedom presupposes a certain culture, and this culture necessarily involves certain constraints. Right? That's the idea. So what is needed to sustain commitment to liberal democracy across time in terms of social ethos and institutional organization? Now, Kant notoriously believed that you can achieve perfect justice in a nation of devils. The devils could achieve perfect justice provided they had the right laws and that they were effectively backed up with sanctions. But there's another view of liberalism that says this is too thin a basis, that the moral character of the individuals in question is also deeply relevant. So there are other liberal thinkers, like Mill, Mazzini, and even Rawls and Nussbaum in our own day, who take the view that there has to be underlying these values, and in order to enable their stable realization across time, some idea of solidarity in the community, some idea of belonging, some idea of common sympathies, some notion of mutual trust. In Nussbaum's case, she says, some form of an emotion worthy of the name love has to be present as the substratum for the realization of these values. Now, if this latter picture is correct, then there's a broader implication, which is that perhaps these underlying conditions are probably best secured, if history is any guide, by the nation state. For all the supposed opposition between state sovereignty and human rights, the sovereign state and all that sustains its sense of identity as one state among others is the primary mechanism, it looks like, for the fulfillment of human rights. After all, one of the best ways to engineer a human rights disaster is by creating a failed state, either through military or economic means. And a telling illustration of this symbiosis of liberal democracy and national sympathy is Estonia. According to Dorothea Boll's chapter in this book, Estonia didn't grant citizenship to its Russian minority, yet it's regarded as the poster child of liberal democracy in the region. Perhaps these two facts are not unconnected. So, of course, the conditions of trust and solidarity don't have a simple one-way relation to the liberal trinity. Achieving the rule of law or democracy can help foster those conditions in a mutually reinforcing upward spiral. People are more likely to trust officials who they know are bound by the rule of law. They're more likely to feel solidarity with fellow citizens and officials if they have a real opportunity to participate as equals in collective decision-making. Or to put it more bluntly, if ordinary people are to be instructed in manners and morals by a liberal elite, they have to believe that the latter have their interests at heart. And giving people a meaningful voice in democratic politics is one way of ensuring this. It is unsurprising, therefore, that moves towards technocracy, transferring decisions out of the domain of democratic contestation and into the hands of experts, can generate a populist backlash. And as Jan Werner Müller insightfully points out in this volume, technocracy and populism feed off each other in an anti-democratic dialectic. They are both, according to Müller, fundamentally anti-pluralist. They believe there is always a single correct answer, whether the answer discerned by experts or the answer discerned by the real people, in a way that excludes democratic debate. Third theme is the international. So,
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Very quickly, to go back to Brexit, which was a theme that came up earlier. A colleague of mine, very distinguished Australian international lawyer, at the time of the EU referendum, I asked him, how he was going to vote in the referendum. He said, obviously, to remain. Why, I asked him. Because the EU is an international institution, was his answer. I refrained from pointing out that the Warsaw Pact was also a treaty-based international institution. Now, there's some grain of truth in what he was saying. The grain of truth is this, that if it's an international institution, it cannot be an institution that is simply the function of any particular nation's naked nationalistic self-interest. So it is true that there is a sense in which international institutions mitigate something that can be a gross problem, which is the aggressive pursuit of nationalist self-interest. But the fact that an international institution is not subject to the naked pursuit of one nation's self-interest doesn't mean necessarily that its particular goals and rules are just in any other respect. And one of the worries, I think, that arises here is that there's often been a kind of progressive belief that if only we can free decision-making from nationalistic assumptions and nationalistic drives, then, of course, a form of cosmopolitan justice will be the natural result. But there's another reading, and the other reading is that these international institutions have been co-opted by very powerful economic forces representing private capital, whose interest is in creating free markets, interest in creating deregulated economies that undermine in various ways the social protections on which the solidarity required for democracy depends. So I would highly recommend a recent book by Robert Kuttner exactly on this theme, where he says one of the problems with the EU is that it became, in a sense, a battering ram for the for the economics of austerity, for the economics of gross deregulation, of the imposition of free markets in a way that undermined the social contract that enabled a real participatory democracy to be possible. So one of the things I like about the book is that there are some voices here, contrary to what often happens where there's a kind of idolatry of the EU, the assumption that it necessarily is operating in accordance with its values. There are some voices that are raising the question about the way it both potentially undermines democratic governance and, secondly, pursues policies that cut away at the solidarity needed for participatory democracy.
Thank you. Thank you.